Sorry, I did that classic, which is start talking while I was still muted. But I'm sure we've all made that mistake over the past couple of years. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the sort of annual TUC Stand Up to Racism conference. We've got over 1,000 people that have booked for the conference this year. And this year's theme is fighting for anti-racist workplaces. Yeah, I just wanted to welcome you all. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers on the first panel. We've got a number of workshops where you'll be able to participate and talk about your experiences and talk about how we can continue the fight against racism. I just wanted to say a couple of words before going over to our speakers. My name, by the way, is Wilf Sullivan. I'm the TUC's Race Equality Officer. And obviously I work with Stand Up to Racism, putting on this event, which is both gives us an opportunity to come together as a community of people, have activists that are fighting against racism in our society, and to help build for the annual event that we do around UN Anti-Racism Day, which this year we'll be doing activities in demos in London and Cardiff. I think it's Cardiff on the 19th and Scotland on the 20th, but it might be, I might have got that wrong, but I'm sure people will if I've given out misinformation, will correct that later. But anyway, this year we will be doing demonstrations, I think, in the context of a government which is strategically using racism to deflect from the real issues that we face in our society. It's so important that actually we get out there and show that we're going to continue to resist. That there's a big community of us there and a growing community of us that are not going to put up with the divide and rule that we see led from the top in our society. I mean, I think the pandemic more than anything demonstrated the institutional racism that exist in our workplace, with disproportionate numbers of people from Black communities dying. And that was very visible on our TV screens during the early days of the pandemic. One of the things that I did at the TUC was to put out a call for people to relate their experiences of how what had happened to them at work during the pandemic. And one particular response really sticks in my mind, which I thought exemplified what was going on out there and what had always been going on out there, which was of a care worker who was the only Black care worker working in a care home, who had been given the job, and only her, of washing the bodies of the elderly people in that home that had died. What it showed was, I think, how, you know, in the workplace, we as Black workers are regarded as so disposable, and that our health and safety and welfare is not a consideration. And what was the government's response? Was firstly to commission an investigation by Kimmy Badnock, which was clearly an attempt to say it was the fault of Black people because somehow or other there was something wrong with our bodies. And secondly, the CRED report from Tony Sewell, which denied institutional racism actually existed. Not that I'm under any illusion. I think that the government are quite clear that institutional racism existed, but wanted to once again set hairs running to deflect us from, you know, from the main task at hand, which is fighting racism in our society and holding them to account for what they do as leaders and what they say, which results in division and friction and violence in our communities. I'm not going to say any more. As I said, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. Unfortunately, our first speaker is still having some connection problems. That's Christina McAnea, but hopefully she will be able to join us. So I'm going to go straight to Kevin Courtney. Kevin.
There you go. Have I done it? Thanks very much, Wilf. Really pleased to be here with you all today. Really pleased to be speaking on such a significant platform. Christina McAnea, General Secretary of Unison, Patrick Roach, General Secretary of Sister Union for us in the education sphere, the NASUWT. Really pleased to be here with Patrick, with Roz from the Scottish TUC, with Shav from the Wales TUC. Really pleased to be here on this joint TUC Stand Up to Racism platform. And like Wilf just said, fighting for anti-racist workplaces. And there's 1,000 people registered for this call. And I want to say to all of you, I know that that's what you're doing. You are trades union members, you're in your workplaces, you're recruiting other people to the unions, and you're trying to bring them in. We're trying to make more anti-racist workplaces. And there are a number of different ways that you are working on that, and that the unions, you know, the union head offices are working on it. This fighting the direct racism that comes up all too often, and seeking to mobilize members of all races against that racism. There's the casework sometimes supporting people who are being unfairly picked on. Then there's the stuff that is, they call it indirect racism. But when you have performance related pay, you know that it is Black workers and often women workers who are less likely to make progression. So fighting that indirect racism. Or when you see something like contracting out, and you know that the workforces who get contracted out and then their conditions run down, they're disproportionately Black workforces. So fighting those indirect racisms as well. And I know that some of you, if you're in the education sphere, and this will happen in other areas as well, but supporting the pupils in our case to grow up in an anti-racist way and to challenge racist attitudes. And in my union and other education unions, we're working with Show Racism the Red Card, a schools competition that we run every year, that we get children just to express their anti-racism. In my union, we've launched an anti-racist framework and trained 1,500 activists on taking that framework, which is around education, into schools. So we're fighting the racism amongst that faces our workmates. We're trying to challenge the racism facing the children, and I know that'll be happening around service users elsewhere. But I think it's also important to see that there are things that we need to work on in the union movement itself. And I know that some of you will be working on this. And I think quite selfishly sometimes for my union, I'm a white older guy. There's some talent amongst white older guys. But we can't just fish in the pool of talent that is white older blokes. If we're doing that, we're missing talent. We need to be fishing in the pool of talent that is our Black workmates. And we need to be finding them and encourage, bringing them into union activity, looking for the obstacles, looking for the branch meeting that actually feels a bit like a boys' club, that is harder to get into. So working on issues in our unions, to challenge our unions, so that we are fishing in the biggest pool of talents. And I know that you're working on that. And I think it's also vital, as well as working on those things in the workplace, that we as union activists, and I still think of myself as a union activist, despite being a general secretary, I'm a union activist. And I think it's important for union activists to seek to mobilize their workmates to things outside work as well, to be on the streets. So Wilf talked about the demonstrations that are coming up in London and Glasgow on the 19th of March and in Cardiff on the 20th of March, because nobody organises a demonstration in Cardiff on the day of a rugby home international, which there is on the 19th of March. So the demonstration in Cardiff on Sunday the 20th. So we're mobilising for those demonstrations as well. And I just want to reflect on the way I'm thinking about that demonstration. It goes from what Wilf talked about, the lessons we have learned from the pandemic, or more precisely, the new light on things that we already knew about that has been shown by the pandemic. So you go back to those early days of March 2020, May, June, and we saw those pictures of the doctors who died in the first instance, and then nurses who died. And we saw how many of those faces, for a good long while, exclusively black and brown people who had died at the beginning stages. And that tells you something about the way our society is organized, and it throws new light on it. And we know that black people have suffered more in the pandemic than others. And that's because it isn't genetic, it's because of their socioeconomic status in jobs where it's hard, where PPE wasn't provided, sometimes where they have the worst shifts, all of those issues, and that light thrown on the issue of racism in our society. But I think the pandemic also throws light on the issue of racism in our world, because now you see that we have this vaccination effort, which has happened in the global north and which has happened to a far lesser extent in the global south. And the reason I want to say this is we've made a banner for my union for March the 19th. We're going to be marching behind a banner that says end vaccine apartheid. Waive the vaccine patents now. And I'd like to invite you to come and march with us and chant for that on March the 19th, because I think we can see in this a picture of the world where the whiter global north has all the advantages and isn't sharing them. It's taken those advantages from the global south in many cases, but they're not sharing the benefits of them. And I look at our Prime Minister, who says that the vaccine, he said this about a year ago now, the vaccination effort comes from greed and capitalism. And that's the way he sees this thing has worked out. And I disagree with that completely. The vaccination effort has come from our public NHS. It's come from scientists, by and large, not motivated by money, but who've been trained by school teachers who are working for the public. You know, it comes from the public sphere. But I think it is true that capitalism and greed might be the problem with why we haven't vaccinated the global south. So I want to be on that demonstration saying that for all of us in this world living together as brothers and sisters, we have to vaccinate the whole world. And I think it also gives us a chance to explain the way racism actually does down all of us. Because if we don't vaccinate the global south, then more variants come, and then they come up to the global north and affect us all here as well. So I think we have to mobilize against racism in our workplaces, the direct racism, the indirect racism, the racism that affects our service users, our pupils in the education union's case. I think we've got to change our unions to make sure they are genuinely open to everybody that wants to come forward and be an activist. So we're fishing in those pools of talent, and we have to mobilize our members onto the streets to challenge racism in our country and around the world. Thank you very much for being here. 1,000 people registered, 1,000 activists fighting against racism. Thanks to the TUC and Stand Up to Racism for organizing this conference today.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I mean, I think the point about actually, you know, that racism isn't just a national problem, it's an international problem. It was well made, and it's so important that we remember that, and that actually a fight against racism hasn't just got to be a national one, but an international effort. I'm going to go straight to Christina, who's managed to overcome her connection problems and is back with us. Christina's a comrade that I go back with for, oh God, about 30 years. Perhaps I'm giving away my age there, but welcome, Christina. Oops. I think Christina's still having problems with her connection. So in the meantime, what I'll do is go to Dr. Patrick Roach, General Secretary of the NASUWT, and a comrade along with many others who's part of the TUC Race Relations Committee and is currently chairing the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wilf, and well, good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here today addressing you all. I really want to thank colleagues from Stand Up to Racism and the TUC for hosting this event again this year. I'm really proud as well to be speaking here today as chair of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force, which is championing the work on anti-racism across our trade union movement. But I'm equally proud to be NASUWT, the teachers' union, as we lead the fight for racial justice in our schools and colleges with our sister unions, the NEU and others, the UCU, to decolonise education and to unite our members, black and white, with our big conversation and our action programme on anti-racism. You know, colleagues, throughout this pandemic, it's been our unions that have been on the front line in the fight against racism. Our unions have been a lifeline for working people, black and white. Our unions have secured safer workplaces, securing the furlough scheme, resisting attempts by employers to worsen our members' terms and conditions. And our unions have been protecting jobs and incomes of working people. You know, it was our movement that spoke out against the government's handling of the pandemic, the failure to provide PPE, to ensure safety in our schools, and their failure to tackle the adverse impacts of emergency measures on our communities. And we've seen how the pandemic is leaving behind a racial injustice legacy to which our unions must organise and respond together. Because, colleagues, let's be in no doubt, the government's hostile environment agenda is alive and kicking, led by a Prime Minister whose track record speaks for itself, and supported by a government that refuses to bring forward legislation to protect workers from fire and rehire, from exploitation, from outsourcing and agency working, and from precarious employment practices. It's a government that refuses to strengthen regulation and enforcement of our workplace rights. And so as a movement, we have to send a clear message to this government that if they won't step up to protect our members' rights, then we will. And that's what the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force is all about. The task force has already agreed an action plan, which will deliver practical actions in the fight against racism, that will join the forces of all unions across all workplaces and sectors, that will develop the skills and confidence of our reps in advancing anti-racism at work, that's going to reach out to black members of unions and to those black workers who've not yet joined a union, because we know that the best place for all workers is to be in a union. It's a task force that's developing tools so that we can win progress on racial justice at the bargaining table. And we're organising too, because we know that diversity is our strength and it makes us stronger. We're taking forward a programme of action across the country to build the next generation of black trade union leaders, and also equipping all of our reps with the skills and the tools to build strong and inclusive trade union branches ready for the next phase of the fight. But you know, too, our movement is demanding answers, colleagues. Answers from the government over their handling of a pandemic which has contributed to widening racial injustice, because we must never let this government off the hook for its actions, sowing the seeds of division, injustice and hatred. Because when Downing Street parted, key workers lost their lives and black workers died disproportionately. Because when black communities faced instant police sanctions and penalties for breaking lockdown rules, the Prime Minister and his chums were allowed to play by their own rules and to act above the law. And when Boris Johnson tells us that he gets it, that the government understands how the British people feel, they're pressing ahead with implementing the outrageous report on race and ethnic disparities, which denied the experiences of our members and claims that institutional racism doesn't exist, denying the reality of the cost of living crisis on all of our members, black and white, a crisis that's dividing our communities and where the government's failure to act is damaging our children's futures. When the government talks of levelling up, the reality is injustice, insecurity, division and fear. And it's public sector workers, key workers, teachers, nurses, doctors, social care staff, shop workers, firefighters, prison officers, local government workers, rank and file civil servants and others who kept the country going. It's our members who are being hit hardest by this government's decade-long assault on jobs. So when they tell us to ride out the storm of this pandemic, we say enough is enough. We must demand change in government. That's why the NSWT is building our members, region by region, nation by nation, demanding pay justice, safety, decent working conditions. And we extend our support and solidarity to our trade union sisters and brothers across the movement who are fighting for justice for their members, because we will never stand by whilst racism exists and where workers, our members and our communities suffer injury, insecurity, hatred and injustice. Colleagues, thanks for what you're doing. Let's unite together in Glasgow, in London, in Cardiff on the 19th and the 20th of March. Colleagues, keep up the fight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. You know, that point about actually public service workers being in the front line is so true. You know, what we need is to force whatever government to reinvest in our public services. It's not just a matter of levelling up, and sometimes I think levelling up really means levelling down. I'm not sure whether Christine's managed to sort out a sound, but we're gonna have another go at this. So Christina, over to you.
Thanks. I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Apologies for that. I've been having trouble all week with my main computer, so I've now joined on an iPad. So I hope you can hear me and see me on this one. Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you. Thanks to the TUC and Stand Up to Racism for organising this again. Really, really important that we don't forget that, you know, the Tories like to try and pretend that nothing has changed, that there is no difference, that the pandemic didn't affect anyone any differently. It was just bad luck. And I think, you know, people have already talked about the pandemic, but one of the key things for me when you look at what happened during the pandemic, particularly on Black workers, was none of this was a surprise to us, but it also wasn't because of bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't anything to do with lifestyle choices. It was absolutely predictable because you could see the number of Black workers who were in the kinds of jobs that would absolutely be affected first and foremost by something as dreadful as the pandemic that we've been through and for many people still going through. You know, we all saw at the beginning, not just the people who work in the essential key services, but one of the early memories I have is when you think back to the beginning of the pandemic when supermarket shelves were empty and there was, you know, chaos at supermarkets when people were trying to access food. And who was often at the centre of that, trying to control that chaos? It was quite often a young security worker within the supermarket who was often a young Black man standing there trying to control the chaos that was going on around him. It's no surprise that Black workers are so badly affected by this, that in some areas, you know, Black men in particular were 4 times more likely to die from the pandemic. These are stark, dreadful statistics. And when you look at some of the services that were also incredibly badly affected, there is a very high proportion of Black workers in them. So you look at the care sector, you look at the health sector, both areas where there's a high proportion of Black staff. So again, not surprising that Black workers are so badly affected. But there's another reason, which is there's actually a clinical reason why this was more likely to affect them, because racism, that day-to-day endemic racism that so many Black people put up with or live with, actually has an impact on people's health. That's been clinically proven. There's evidence that shows that. This is not an accident. This is something that is caused also by racism in society, that persistent wearing down of people's resilience. And for all of those reasons, trade unions are incredibly important. And I think we have a responsibility in the trade union movement. That's why I'm so pleased that the TUC and Stand Up to Racism are again joining forces to do this. And as Kevin has mentioned earlier, because I did actually hear some of this, Kevin was talking about the demos that are coming up, how important these are, that we keep this high on the agenda, because we cannot rely on the moral vacuum that we see in Westminster from these Tories. It has to be the trade union movement who is fighting to actually expose the ongoing scourge of racism in our country and across the world, but is also coming up with solutions and proposals about how we can fight it. So in Unison, it's one of our top priorities. We work very closely with our National Black Members Committee and with our Black activists across the union, going out to try and ensure that we are listening to the voices of our Black activists, that they are leading the campaign in unison and feeding into the campaigns the really important work that Patrick's doing on his group, and the work that the TUC and Stand Up to Racism and the other organisations that we work with are doing, that it's our Black members who are leading on that. And some of the key things we'll be fighting for, as well as challenging racism wherever we see it, speaking up against racism wherever we see it, exposing it wherever we see it. That's a responsibility for all of us. But the campaigns that we run about fighting for decent pay, decent standards of living, safety at work, that affects everyone. And if we can get it right for everyone in a workplace, we get it right for Black workers as well. If we can get things right for Black workers, as in better safety, we get it right for everyone. So this is integral to the work that we do in Unison, is that we're continuing to work with our sister trade unions, to work with the TUC, to work with other campaigning organisations to make sure that we can keep up the fight. But one of the key things as well we need to work on is keep up the campaigning work for some structural changes within our society. Things like a national strategy to tackle health inequalities that would expose the fact that so many Black people are so badly affected by things like this pandemic, and indeed by other issues. The need for the government to enact Section 1 of the Equality Act that covers socio-economic disadvantage. The need to make the race ethnicity pay gaps something which is absolutely one that employers have to do something about, that's a legal duty for employers to do something about, and that we as trade unions are able to get the information we need and to expose ethnicity pay gaps where we see them and campaign to change them. These are bread and butter trade union issues, but they are absolutely integral to our fight against racism. So I'm very happy to give a guarantee that this will remain a top priority for Unison, that we will continue to work closely with other organisations and our sister unions to make sure that we can expose racism wherever we see it, and that we are central to the fight of it. Because quite frankly, if the trade unions aren't there, nobody else will be doing it. We have to be at the forefront of this because we are the main voice for Black workers in our society. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invite, and I look forward to Unison continuing to play a large part in the campaign going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. We've got a massive task ahead of us, and I think as Christina says, we all need to make that a priority. We're streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, and obviously people are participating in their own way by making comments in the chat. And I just wanted to read out a couple of comments from the chat. We've got James Eden from Chesterfield TUC, who says, "We are today on the picket line with Just Eat delivery drivers, overwhelmingly from Black backgrounds, who face a 24% pay cut. Struggle and strikes being workers together and give us a platform to challenge racism." I mean, I think it's a demonstration what James says of how employers are using the crisis that we're in as an excuse to attack workers' terms and pay and conditions. Again, Evan Pritchard as posted from Manchester Trades Council, saying, I'm sure my fellow delegates will want me to send solidarity to all victims of racism in the workplace and to all trade unionists who are resisting it. Thanks, Evan, and it's great to know that we've got an audience from right around the country. Kim Sasha says, racism is not just the name calling, but covers a whole dimension of discrimination in the teaching profession. How many black teachers are in supply teaching due to harassment from school leaders? This leads to a loss of earnings and poor living standards. And I think, thanks for that, Kim, because, one of the things that we know is that casualisation amongst black workers has grown since the start of the pandemic. It was already disproportionate from the economic crash in 2008, but that insecurity of work in our communities is something that is growing along with in-work poverty. So keep your comments coming into the chat. And we'll get to a few more of them later. But I'm going to move straight on, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome Rozanne Foyer from the Scottish TUC here. I mean, we've alongside the demonstrations in London and Cardiff, there's been a even longer running than we've been doing it, anti-racist demonstration in Scotland, which I participated in my time as well. And hopefully, when things get better, we'll be able to do again. So Roz, welcome.
Thanks very much, Will. Just making sure that my mute was off there. And can I thank the TUC and Stand Up to Racism for inviting me along here today to represent the STUC. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all. And it's very important to us at the STUC to be supporting this conference today, because we really do know how important it is to continue to mobilise that fight back against racism. And we know that that fight back needs to happen both in our communities, on our streets, and also in our workplaces. And as Wilf was saying, the STUC does have a proud history of claiming St Andrew's Day in Scotland as a day of action on tackling racism. This actually goes back 33 years with us organising an anti-racism march and rally on our National Day every year. And it dates back to 1988, when the BNP tried to hold rallies in Glasgow in an attempt to seize upon national sentiment at that time and to combine it with the poverty and alienation felt by many workers and their communities at that time, and turn that into hate and division. And the STUC was very clear then, as it is now, that there could be no complacency about Scotland being immune from this. Scotland was not free from racism in those days, and it is certainly not free from racism now. Then, as now, we had communities torn apart by unemployment, low pay, job insecurity, rising costs and poor housing. And this, of course, is exactly the context in which disinformation and fear can be easily spread with extremely dangerous consequences. So just as we did then, we need to continue to recognise that workers are not immune to that climate of fear created by the Johnson government, the Tories and their allies, and only an active campaigning approach to combating these lies will do. And there can be no better example of workers and communities coming together to oppose racism than the Battle of Kenmure Street on the 13th of May last year, when the people of Glasgow pushed back on the Home Office's Dawn Raid policy and the specific targeting of Sumit Sedav and Lakvir Singh. Hundreds of Glaswegians, including many trade unionists, gathered in Kenmure Street to block the Dawn Raid vans of the Home Office. And I'd like to pay tribute to all of those people like Mohammed Asif and Zanira Ali, who were involved in that historic display of defiance. And this active alternative to sowing the seeds of division in our communities deserves celebration, but more importantly, it demands replication. That's why part of our message this year must be to redouble our efforts to combat racism and support grassroots community organising in our towns and cities. But it also means looking inwards and recognising that as trade unions, we have more work to do within our own structures. I'm really proud of the lead taken by our STUC Black Workers Committee on this over the last 25 years, but we need to take more action at every level, from our union branches to our head offices, to combat racism, to actively promote equality, and to actively widen our diversity. Because too many Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers still face systematic and institutionalised racism, with not enough in senior roles or leadership positions at work or in their unions. They face the struggle to have the inequitable legacy of slavery and imperialism acknowledged, and we have to join them in that fight. They face daily racial violence and harassment, and sadly that still includes police violence. And the pandemic, as others have said, has really highlighted some of the symptoms of the structural inequalities that we knew already existed, with evidence showing higher death rates, less access to PPE, people more likely to be in lower paid frontline roles, less likely to work from home, more precarity and more job insecurity across our BAME communities. So while the trade union movement should be proud of its track record in standing up against racism, we also need to approach this issue with a huge dose of humility. We as a movement must do more, and that's why now more than ever we need an organised, united and relevant trade union movement that places minority and disadvantaged voices at its core to combat the rising injustices our society has, and to build an economy that works for the many, not just the few. To do this, we have to become truly inclusive and take a real intersectional approach to our work, ensuring that our decisions and policies recognise the multiple discriminations faced by our members in society. So that's why Scotland's trade unionists will be joining with anti-racism campaigners, community campaigners, youth climate strikers and anti-poverty campaigners by gathering under the People's Assembly banner next Saturday, the 12th of February, to fight back against this cost of living crisis. And that's why we will unite again with these groups on the 19th of March in Glasgow to participate in the UN Anti-Racism Day demonstrations. Because we all need to focus now on building progressive alliances and movement building. We have to unite and fight all of the inequalities that our economy has been built on. We have to fill the vacuum with hope that the racists want to fill with hate. And we can have the best arguments, but the only thing that will deliver real change is mass people power. And to deliver that people power, we have to be united, not divided, because as the ruling classes fear, when we the workers are united, we can't be defeated. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roz. You know, it's so true. It is about power, and it is about us coming together in solidarity and demonstrating that power by putting up resistance. And you know what happened in Glasgow was a lesson for us all. I think it showed that we can come together, not just as trade unionists, but as communities, and push back on some of the most extreme actions that governments take in terms of attacking our communities. And for me, one of the things about an almost like police state is the spectre of dawn raids, people being dragged out of their homes by the state, first thing in the morning. It's just something that we can do to help protect people in our communities and show that actually we are there to protect their rights, their civil and their human rights. I'm going to move on. It's great to have a Shav here, a long-time comrade leading the fight in Wales. So Shav, over to you.
Thanks, Wilf, and apologies. My dad has been in hospital since Boxing Day, and so we had a bit of a family thing going on this morning. So apologies for my late join. So I've missed, unfortunately, I've missed what my comrades and my colleagues have been talking about, but I'm sure many of us are going to say very similar things. And the fact of the matter is that we have got a UK government that is absolutely racist. They are offensive. They are most definitely actively looking to remove our rights. They are actively and continuously dismissing our lived experiences, and they are repeatedly failing to deal with the undisputable evidence of institutional structural racism, sexism, misogyny, and so forth. We've seen under this government and under this cabinet the scapegoating of refugees and migrants continuing. The Nationality and Borders Bill, of course, is one of those things that removes the right for people to seek asylum in Britain, and penalizes people who are, by definition, actually very simply in need of shelter. A couple of years ago, when the Plenary camp had been set up, it was an old disused barracks of the MOD. I went and I was actually asked by some of the individuals who were there, who actually set up their own union, to go and visit and to speak with them, and to basically do a bit of a site recce and see what was going on. And it was pretty shocking, to say the least, in terms of the way that people were being housed. It was at the time of the pretty much at the height of the pandemic. People were getting sick. They were literally being they were on bunk beds right next to each other. There was no ventilation and so forth. So the situation was absolutely awful. So we made a point of making sure that the Wales TUC worked with other organisations, grassroots organisations, including Stand Up to Racism here in Wales, to lobby the Welsh Government and get them to actually back our calls for the UK government to shut it down immediately, which they eventually did. But then to kind of get to a position where we saw all of that, and you feel like some kind of like maybe there's some progress here. And then, of course, you know, we get the Nationality and Borders Bill, and of course we get the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report that very clearly denies institutional racism and the experiences and everything that has been personally shared by people, by those individuals who have been active in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also all of the evidence that we as trade unionists have been picking up in our workplaces for such a long time. You know, as the fact of the matter is that for us, this is nothing new. We've been dealing with racism in the workplace for an extremely long time. Wilf has been at the forefront of, you know, fight and battles on all different levels when it comes to the need for us to actively tackle racism and discrimination in the workplace. So I'm really glad that we're having the conversations right now. That's really important, because this is about us building for March to make sure that we have a very clear, visible presence of trade unionists on the streets. That's going to be really important. But what we have got the situation now, of course, where you've got this divide and rule continuing. And of course, this is all up against the backdrop over the last couple of days, where we've heard from the head of Bank of England, someone who's on what 500k or something that he gets nicely to take home, and God knows what else he has stored away for a rainy day. He's actually believes that he is in a position to tell workers not to be demanding decent pay rises, good pay rises, because of the fact that if we were to do so, then all of a sudden inflation is going to be set to get worse. So we are fighting on so many different levels. We've come out of post-Brexit. We've seen the wage stagnation going on for an extremely long time. We have had over a decade of austerity. This is nothing new, really. And continuously, it is the poorest people, it is hardworking people, everyday people who are being hit the hardest. The amount of individuals who are already in debt crisis is unbelievable. And yet we've got, Rishi Sunak, who believes that actually, the one way of all of this is that for, he thinks that if he bungs us about £7 a week, also more than half of that, of course, is going to have to be paid back. That somehow that is targeted support for people. The fact of the matter is that we need the UK government to be getting urgent help to families who need it the most. They need to be raising that universal credit. We need that windfall tax on the excessive profits from the North Sea gas to cut bills and boost investment in affordable energy as well. And here in Wales, we have a very, very difficult position because we're particularly vulnerable when it comes to stagnant pay rising and living costs. And the Bevan Foundation, an organisation here in Wales, has pointed out that we have lower incomes, lower average incomes and higher fuel costs than anywhere else in the UK. So that is the reason why not only have we got to continue fighting for decent pay rises, we also need to be fighting for a lot more. That we can't just continue on supporting this nonsense of levelling up. We've got to see those new jobs coming through, and they've got to be real decent jobs. They've got to be green jobs. Here in Wales, we've identified there's a possibility of creating 66,000 jobs that are green jobs. We can be improving our transport networks. We can be investing in green steel. We can be improving our broadband structure. If we do all of those things and we get pay packets rising, then the economy can recover. Because at the moment, most genuinely, people are so desperate. They are so desperate because, this idea about making a decision between whether it's food or fuel, this has been going on for an extremely long time. It's just that to some extent, it's kind of like we've been dealing with a pandemic and, we had that small little increase that we saw, of course. But the fact of the matter is here in Wales, of course, 1 in 3 children are still living in poverty. And many of those are living in households that aren't actually even eligible for the £200 that the Welsh government has, which we've very much welcomed, but that they've decided to double the winter fuel scheme as well. So that's a good thing. But the real levers here ultimately lie with the UK government. And the only way that things are going to change, and it is workers who are not going to pay for the financial crisis of 2008 or for any economic mismanagement. We've had that decade of public sector pay cuts. We've had those flat wages. We're not going to be prepared to support any mistakes of the past. And we are most definitely going to be protecting the dignity and living standards of ordinary people. And this is not about a them and us. This is about us, every single one of us standing together, united as trade unionists.
Thanks very much, Shavanah. I think it's very important that we understand that, that what happens in our economy is crucial in terms of any debate about racism, because ultimately racism is about an ideology to extort. And so it's really important that we remember that we do have to up our game, up our expectations, up what we demand so that we get what we deserve from work, because after all, it's workers who create the wealth. It's workers who create the wealth that gets squirreled away in offshore bank accounts for the benefit of the few. I'm going to move straight on. We were due to have Manuel Cortez from the TSSA, but unfortunately he's got internet problems, so can't join us. But Ricky Jones, who's the Equality Officer for the TSSA, is going to speak in his place. Ricky.
Thanks, Wilf. Yes, and Manuel Cortez sends his apologies. He very much wanted to be on this platform. along with these wonderful speakers that we have today. I'm very pleased to be amongst you all in his place. I've known Will for a long time. Kevin, I've known for many years. Myself and Kevin's wife worked in a primary school in Hackney when I was an educator. When I was the play centre manager and Unison's education convener for Hackney at that time as well, doing many things. So it's great to have hear Christine speak. I've heard her many times in the past as well at conferences and stuff. I'm going to start talking about racism from the very start for me. Back in the 70s, a mixed race boy, 10 days old, coming out of hospital. Mother couldn't have him because I was the result of a good fling between two married people. Going to go off with the social services when my grandmother stepped in and said, "You're not taking him, I'll have him, he can live with me." Little did she know that the racism she was going to have from that point on, being a white woman, walking down the street with a mixed race boy, being called black man's oars and having people spit her in the street. At those days, I wanted to be white. I didn't want to be white because I'm not proud of the colour of my skin. I wanted to be white to stop the pain and anguish that my family was feeling as a result of the racism they was dragged into at that time in life. I then moved on. I then became a trade unionist for Unison. I then went on from there to become a full-time officer working for TSSA, where I am today, and love. Got to know Wilf. Wilf sent me on a black summer school for officers, and that's where I learned to be very proud of the colour of my skin. And I'm not angry about all those people in the 70s that did what they did to my family. They gave me the strength to be the type of person I am today, wanting to fight for people's rights in the workplace. And believe you me, we have got some issues that we are fighting. I would like to pay tribute at this stage before I move on to Belly Majunga. Belly Majunga was one of our members at Victoria Station, a transport worker in the front line, being spat on by a racist person as a result of them not being happy about a disgruntled ticket or a situation similar. As a result of that, then went on to die from COVID. Many of our transport workers are in the front line and they are multicultural. And they are facing issues with this pandemic. Myself, I was in hospital with COVID not Christmas, but the Christmas before. Went on to be long COVID. While Boris Johnson and his cronies were in number 10 having their parties. The people that are suffering most as a result of the pandemic have been our multicultural BAME members. And all this is going on while those at number 10 think it's okay to have their parties and just carry on as if nothing's happened. Theresa May and her hostile environment policy led to many issues. And lots of people being deported from this country who had indefinite rights to remain in this country. It still goes on today. We're still getting planes with people shackled on their way to Jamaica who have lived here all their life and don't know that country. There's lots that's got to change. In our own transport industry, we face many of our multicultural workers fighting to get up the ladder, fighting to get through that glass ceiling and not being successful. Why? Because it's the right-wing fascists that they've got in their organisations that are sitting in those high-paid jobs that are stopping them from doing it. We don't just see them when we turn up to the stand up to racism demonstrations. They don't just come out of the cupboard and say hi. They're in a lot of the workplaces where our members work. And they are stopping our members from getting the jobs that they deserve. The ethnicity pay gap report, and I just want to talk about that. I know Christine mentioned it and other people mentioned it. In the places where we've been successful as a union in fighting to get companies to bring in the ethnicity pay gap reporting, it's little but a piece of paper for them companies to say, we've done the right thing. We're still battling with those companies to do what needs to be done for our multicultural members in the low paid jobs to get what they deserve. The other thing I want to talk about is what else is going on in the transport industry with many people looking at possibly losing their jobs as a result of the round of redundancies they would like to see happen in Network Rail and within our train operating companies. Believe you me, TSSA, along with the other unions, transport unions, are building a strong union background, with all of them being ready for that fight when it comes. Because I believe that we're going to have a fight to keep those members their jobs. And I do believe that they will probably be looking at compulsive redundancies as a part of that fight. Again, who does that impact most? It impacts our multicultural members, again, in those frontline jobs that will be mostly impacted by that situation. The last thing I want to talk about is the fact that we are, as a union, struggling as a result of the fact of many, many members we may be losing. But the fight goes on. We're looking at amalgamating with other unions. We're looking very much at the moment of amalgamating with a union called the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, so we can be strong and solid to support our members and stay where we are. The fight goes on, brothers and sisters, and I thank everybody on this platform who's spoken today so strongly and passionately in favour of the fact that we need to do more to deal with the racist issues that go on, not just in our workplaces, but out on the streets as well, as I've spoken about, as other people have spoken about. Do what you can within your workplaces to make a difference. But remember, if we want the ethnicity pay gap reporting to be sorted within the workplaces, we can't rely on this right-wing government to do it. We have to take that fight on behalf of our members to those companies to make that happen. Thanks, everybody, and thank you for having me on this platform. Very honoured.
Thanks so much, Ricky. I mean, the points you make about actually us needing to step up in terms of collective bargaining and negotiating if we want stuff with the employers and not just relying on the government to implement it is so true. It's what we do that matters and that changes the world. And as you so rightly say, the fight goes on. I just wanted to read a couple more comments from the chat. Keep your comments coming in. John Woods sends solidarity from Portsmouth Trades Council. He says, proud to have supported Stand Up to Racism visuals on South Sea Beach, highlighting the refugees and migrants murdered in the Channel by this government's racist environment. Zanera says, couldn't agree more with Roz Foyer. We need to double our efforts and support grassroots movements fighting against racism, inequality. Amazing contributions from all speakers. So, you know, thanks very much for your comments. Keep them coming in, and when I've got an opportunity, I will read more out. I'm going to go straight on now to Juliana Ojinnaka from UCU, a union that's very much been doing stuff in education around decolonisation. So, Juliana, across to you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you. As Wilf have mentioned, my name is Juliana Ojinnaka. I'm the chair of the University and Colleges Union Black Members Standing Committee. Thank you for having me on this call. Solidarity to you from UCU to TUC and the Stand Up to Racism for organizing this conference. And my solidarity to all the speakers. You've really been a fantastic morning. I couldn't have spent it in a better company. Okay, so Black men and women workers as marginalized groups are underrepresented in the trade union. And whilst, yes, government has done a lot of damage to Black workers and to Black people and to all marginalized groups and so on, we also need to do a lot more in our unions, and has already been pointed out. So a lot of Black workers are in the trade union, are underrepresented in the trade union leadership and structures. And education that I work in is no exception. Unions should be encouraging more Black workers to participate actively at branch levels and taking up committee roles. So as workers with protected characteristics, we should be given facilitated time and represented equitably. As unions, we should be challenging and resisting institutional racism in all its form. We should be planning and developing Black Lives Matter initiatives and programs for all our members by committing resources and making regular statements to support Black Lives Matter initiatives and programs in our union institute and our institutions as well. Unions should get their institution to revisit and address issues around policies in relation to recruitment and selection of Black workers, because as I've already mentioned, a lot of our workers are on the casualized list. I have had lecturers complain time and time again, being in an institution for 10 years and not having a permanent contract and not being able to plan their future and not being able to organize anything in terms of mortgages or buying houses. So we should be, in the union, be educating ourselves on how racist bullying and harassment manifests itself in our institution as well as within our unions as well. And of course, we need to follow up a lot of the policies that have been introduced before by our sectors and looking at how they manifest in terms of the bullying and harassment that takes place, and also the microaggression that takes place within the unions and within our institutions as well. These are things that are happening on a regular basis, because a lot of the time I often ask myself, governments cannot get ahead without, if we are organized, if we're really organized, if we're really working in the interest of all of our workers, government cannot do what they do to workers. And somebody said this morning in another call that I was in, why do people join unions if not to improve their pay and their working conditions? So why are the conditions of Black workers not being improved? So if equality is to be at the heart of our unions, then we have to be committed to challenging racism in all its forms, and especially in the workplace. And that's why in the UCU, we've also organized the week of action against workplace racism, which is going to take place in the last week of February. Unions and institutions should be committed to supporting and building anti-racist networks in the workplace and outside of the workplace. This brings about community accountability. It's not enough that we do all these bits in our unions or in the institution, but we need to show our communities what we're doing in their interest, what we're doing for the community, what we're doing to address issues of racism and its manifestation in our communities. So if we are to address the underrepresentation of Black workers at all levels, we need to be doing a lot more. We need to be organizing mentoring support systems within the unions, because I do know that some of the unions have got a very good Black sections within it, but they need to be doing a lot more in providing training programs to enable members to develop skills of leadership, of planning, of organizing within the communities and so forth. And so we should be seeking to, as union, as has been mentioned before, to address issues of the race pay gap in our community, especially race and gender pay gap, because obviously Black women are at the bottom of this whole pay gap that exists. And this what the pay gap does is to show where Black workers are located within our institutions. Because if we don't look at it, then we'll never be clear why it is that there is this huge pay disparity within our workplace and so on. And also, we know already that Black workers are disproportionately placed in our workplace as casual workers and are on precarious contracts and therefore low paid. And this obviously feeds into the wage pay gap and so on. And so it makes it difficult for them to plan their future. The pay gap between Black and white staffs in universities is 17% at the present time. And for Black women lecturers, it's a lot wider. And that's something that we need to be looking at. The other thing that we need to look at is where Black lecturers are located, especially those people who want to rise up into the structures. In the universities, Black university lecturers still make up only 1% of the professors. So those people who are in the professorial position, only 1% are Black people. So unions should step up. This is for all unions. We should step up to stop the unequal impact of COVID-19, as it's been mentioned before, time and time again, and I didn't want to go into too much detail about this, but Black workers in the education are also at the forefront of this COVID, because we're at the forefront of teaching all manner of groups of people, because wherever we can get the contract, we take it. and therefore are more exposed to COVID-19. And one of the things that we have to be aware of, and some people have mentioned this already, bosses have a long tradition of dividing workers. So it's about time unions speak up loudly and take decisive action against workplace racism. We should be actively embedding issues linked to racial inequality in our bargaining approaches. So anti-racist workplace works in the interest of all of us, and we should all be challenging it if we're to make life for Black workers a reality. I'd like to stop there, and if there's any question, I'll take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Juliana, and thanks for reminding us that, you know, actually we need to keep up the fight and the struggle to make our unions more inclusive. That, you know, back in early 2000, when the TUC had the Stephen Lawrence task force, there was a recognition that, you know, we as organisations had a problem with institutional racism and needed to do more, and that hasn't gone away, and we still need to do more, and that's absolutely crucial if we're going to build solidarity, because solidarity isn't just a word. You know, you know, it has to become a real watchword in what we do in our organising. And if we don't have that solidarity, if we have divisions within our unions, then we are not going to be able to build the strength and power that we need to make the change that we want to see. I'm going to go on and ask Ian Taylor from the CWU to speak. Ian, I've known for a very long time. We were together on the TUC Race Relations Committee, and has always been a beacon of light up in Cumbria. So Ian, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Wilf. And it is Manchester, by the way. Don't worry about it. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, conference. And I think I'm probably at a good point to follow on from Juliana, because I think she probably touched on the three pillars that I'm going to try and touch on. But I suppose the first thing I would like to say and talk about, and when we talk about Boris's racist agenda and Boris's racist offensive, I think we should recognise that the Black lived experience does not have the luxury of selecting any particular government in recent times as standing out in terms of truly tackling racism and the inequalities that plague our society. Because unfortunately, again, the issue of race inequality and the ever-growing class divide is not particularly to either a Boris Johnson government or any of the governments that we've seen in recent times, because whichever government you choose to look at, you will see the essential structural pillars that support racism and exploitation remain intact. And pretty much in the same way the civil servants who service whichever party makes up the government remain intact. And so I'm going to choose to use this time, if I can, to focus as to what it is I and my trade union believe is a few priorities going forward if we are to build anti-racist workplaces. And firstly, I think if we are to truly achieve an anti-racist core to our movement, including within the workplace, it is going to involve speaking directly to our members. And I don't mean just speaking to our members and lecturing to our members, but it's going to be equally important that we listen to our members and for them to help us shape our anti-racist identity. Because we don't believe this conversation has happened to any great degree, actually taking it direct to our members in the workplace. And I think one of the reasons we haven't had that conversation, because it potentially is a difficult conversation, and because we may just be slightly afraid of what we find amongst our membership. But I will say this, it is a conversation we have to have, and we must confront it at some stage. And within that conversation, I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, and to some degree we possibly will discover whether we have got our narrative absolutely right. Because as uncomfortable as that may sound, we do have to confront these issues, because there is more, I believe, more than anecdotal evidence out there that those that seek to divide us have gained significant traction, and I believe will continue to do so. And I also believe there's always, and there will continue to be, room for self-assessment and reassessment if required. But you know, when I talk about the narrative and various things and the rise of the anti-woke brigade, you know, that's a whole separate conference all on its own. But I think it's a conversation we have to have. And this conversation I refer to with our members, I'm absolutely convinced it will put us in a better place to tackle racism in the workplace, and we'll be richer for having had that conversation. But secondly, that conversation really must result in the trade union movement, I believe, becoming the vanguard of the anti-racist movement, but not merely in addition to, a supporter of, but the vanguard. And that's notwithstanding some of the excellent work that's gone on, that Stand Up to Racism does, and other organisations that, quite frankly, have filled the vacuum left by the trade union movement, have done for a significant number of years. But I reckon in doing so, we need to tackle racism on our own terms, and not only within our structures, but within the workplace, and ultimately, by the way, out in our communities. So it's my view, it's the absolute duty of the trade union movement as the main organisation representing and organising working people to be out there tackling racism. And also that will result in the trade union movement becoming synonymous with anti-racism, because whether we like it or not, unfortunately, currently, that simply is just not the case. And thirdly, I think once the movement itself has earned its independent anti-racist credentials, I think it must have as one of its key objectives and the desire intent to build and create some community cohesions, because we've got an army of people out there doing some great things in the community, fighting inequality, fighting for justice. Many of them are members, but oddly, they're not doing so with their trade union hats on, and neither are they doing that with the full support of their trade union. And I've got to say this, you know, as the food and fuel poverty begins to bite, that's on the horizon. You know, it will come with the associated rise in racism built on the divisions, and the customary scapegoating will start to take hold. And I reckon the big question will be is where will the trade union be when that starts to permeate within our company, in our communities. And I think currently the trade union movement quite often is sadly missing as a presence of the ground, and conspicuously so quite often. So I think we've got to not kid ourselves on about what it is and the size of the task we have, because it's not in the interest of the system, the government, and whatever we considered the pillars to be that support racism, to eradicate racism, because racism is actually it's rooted in exploitation, and quite frankly, the current economic structures and the economic structures we've had for a millennium actually rely on it. So it's crucial, I believe, that our movement is focused on confronting racism whilst building community cohesion. So I am going to summarize and try and suggest that the movement needs to refocus and reconcentrate itself. And I think that's going to involve listening to members, talking directly to them, talking to them about the collective strength, and embedding the undeniable truth, embedding it within our workplaces and in our communities, that until we deal with race inequality, we've got absolutely no chance of addressing overall class inequality. So investing in that conversation, funding our activities out in the community is going to be essential. Yes, that means putting some of our money where our mouth is. And you know, there are many more issues out there, including our international work, issues around immigration, the relevance of immigration, not only to the anti-racist agenda, but to the trade unions' role in the workplace, because, you know, immigration doesn't drive wages down, and employers do. And there is so much more. But I am mindful of the clock and the guillotine, so I am going to leave it there, and I'm going to thank you very much for your time and your indulgence.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, what you said was so important that, you know, we can't take it as read that our members are on board with anti-racism. We have to, and we know that our members' views are a reflection of, often a reflection of wider society's views, and of course influenced by the narrative that the government and the press push, and that's a racist narrative. And you know, unless we lead the opposition to that narrative in terms of the conversations that we have with our members, that there is no opposition to the racist narrative that's around us all in society. So we as a movement have that responsibility. And thanks also for the point about you know, us being more active within communities. We are part of the community, and I, you know, sometimes despair that you're almost like this false division gets made between community activism and trade union activism, because ultimately we're all, in whatever way, we're active fighting for a better and a fairer and a juster society. I'm going to read a couple more comments, a few more comments we've had from the chat. Michelle from Lincoln says, all trade unionists should get involved with their local trades councils if at all possible to build better networks to fight for better pay conditions and against racism and inequality. And I've got to say, you know, that's so true. People should remember their trade union history. Actually, it was trades councils that started the TUC, not trade unions. And trades councils are an important link between trade union branches in their areas and community campaigns. And we need to make sure that that's embedded in our activism. Also, a message from People Before Profit, which is solidarity with ongoing strikes at Barts NHS Trust and Great Ormond Street Hospital, strikes for equality and against racism. Yeah, two very important disputes, and we hope that later on in the workshops that we'll have some contributions from people involved in those disputes. Zanera says, couldn't agree more with Roz Foyer. We need to double our efforts and support grassroots movements fighting against racism and inequality. Amazing contributions from all speakers. And one last one, which I very much, I must say, I identify. Stephanie Blythe said, I'm tired of talking. I just want justice for all employees and society now before I retire. And you know, I'm down with you on that one, Stephanie. You know, it's not very far away for me in terms of retirement, but I don't want justice delayed. I want justice now, and I think you know, we should all demand justice now. You know, because actually the incremental approach doesn't stop people suffering. I'm gonna move on now. Sabby, Dhalu was due to speak next, but unfortunately she's not well. So I'm going to read out a statement from Sabby. Thank you to the TUC, all unions, and everybody supporting and participating in this conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Recent examples of racism in the workplace illustrate the importance of today's conference. A police officer at the Metropolitan Police was promoted from constable to sergeant, despite failing to report misconduct regarding racist and misogynistic messages within the force, once again highlighting the deep institutional racism in the police force. Racism is also deeply rooted in the NHS. Chair of the British Medical Association, Dr. Chan Nagpal, said that the NHS is riddled with racism after a recent survey found at least 75% of Black and minority ethnic doctors experienced racism more than once in the last 2 years. This is particularly shameful given the NHS's diverse workforce. Cricketer Azim Rafiq did much to expose institutional racism within his workplace of Yorkshire Cricket Club. However, there has been a reluctance by the English Cricket Board to take proper action against racism, despite over 4,000 complaints. This is hardly surprising given the government's approach to racism. Racism in the workplace is a product of racism in wider society. Last week, aka Stephen Axley Lennon and hundreds of his far-right and fascist supporters once again whipped up his campaign of hatred, division and racism and Islamophobia in Telford. Thankfully, local trade unions, labour movement and anti-racist and anti-fascist activists mobilised against the racist and fascist. Remember, Tommy Robinson called for a vote for Boris Tories in 2019. That's because Boris' leadership of the Tories is like Enoch Powell is in charge. Look at what they've done. Attacked Black Lives Matter movement, commissioned a report denying the existence of institutional racism, a propaganda campaign to deny that structural racism is the root cause of Black communities disproportionately dying and being hospitalised due to COVID. Sacked NASUWT Ghani MP because she is a Muslim and failed to address Islamophobia in the Tories. Shamefully turned away boats in the Channel full of vulnerable, desperate people fleeing war, climate change, poverty and persecution. People are dying because they can't get here safely. Now the government is trying to get the Navy to intervene to turn away boats because PCS has organised a successful campaign to stop Border Force from intervening. The Nationality and Borders Bill is a racist piece of legislation designed to appease the likes of Tommy Robinson that could strip any Black person of our British citizenship without notice, invalidate asylum claims made by undocumented people, criminalise asylum seekers and those who help them, and must be opposed. There is a danger that by the end of the March, there will be no COVID public health measures. We have continued to campaign for zero COVID strategy that has seen viruses successfully suppressed in several countries. At the very least, we must support independent SAGE demands for a vaccine plus strategy. The COVID public health crisis and the living standards crisis, both of which disproportionately impact on Africans, Caribbean, Asian and other Black and minority ethnic communities, and the current political crisis means racism will be used even more to divide, distract BMN communities. Regardless of who takes over from Johnson, whoever takes over from Johnson, racism will still play a part in the government's agenda. Fighting racism must be a priority for the trade union movement. I urge everybody to join the march against racism, demos against marking UN Day, Racism Day in London, Glasgow, on Saturday the 19th of March, and in Cardiff on Sunday the 20th of March. Thanks Sabby for the contribution. So sorry you couldn't be here with us. We're coming to the end of this session now. I want to thank all the speakers for I think some really inspiring speeches and some raising issues that we do need to address and we really need to think very deeply about in terms of how we turn the trade union movement into a truly powerful fighting force to push back against the racism that is coming to us from all directions. I'm gonna just ask Wayman to say a few words on behalf of Stand Up to Racism before we finish. Wayman.
I just want to welcome you and thank all the speakers for their contribution today. I think the seriousness in which racism was dealt with was really important. And I want to just mention two things. Firstly, Frederick Douglass said that they use racism to divide each to conquer both. So I want to start off with our victories. And I think it's important that we remember this. I remember the parents of Stephen Lawrence's going to the TUC to ask for support to expose the murder of Stephen. And the reason why I'm starting with that is because the strength of the trade union movement is a reason why we've had victories. I remember the leader of the BNP getting 1 million votes in this country and being in a strong enough position actually to make it very, very difficult. The reason why I say this is because if we start from our victories and how we won that, I think it can help us in the struggles that we are facing. Because I thought it's a very serious discussion, and I think that the BNP were destroyed, but fundamentally because the trade union movement was at the forefront of the defeat of what they did. That meant we blocked them on the streets, and we also blocked them inside the workplaces. I think we're going to have to use these methods again. Let me be absolutely clear. I do not believe Boris Johnson is a fascist or anything like that, but I do believe that he's using racist populism to divide our side, and it is effective sometimes. And therefore, I think that if you look at what he's said recently, it's not an accident that he said he's going to re-recruit Linton Crosby back in the aftermath of the problems that he's facing. So we can expect not just the racist offences that's taking place now, but a redoubling of the effort in order to divide and rule. And so the discussions that we're having here is to make sure that doesn't happen. Prevention is sometimes irrelevant, it's critical. I think, as people said last year, I remember coming round in an intensive care thing when last Christmas after I'd suffered from COVID. And I honestly tell you that when they talk about the importance of the NHS and the importance of multicultural, multiracial people coming together, it's just not something that we say. It means actually the difference between sometimes life and death. I don't mean that in a trite way. I mean, I'm absolutely serious about that. And that's the reason why we talk about one of the impacts of the pandemic is the crisis. I mean, apparently they've lost 44 billion pounds. They don't know where it's gone. It's disappeared. I'm sorry, I do know where it's gone. It's disappeared into their pockets. I'll tell you this as well, Clause 9. On Clause 9 of the nationalities, we should fight the whole bill, but it's very important we recognise there'll be an attack on trade unions in a particular way, because they're saying they've got the right to strip you of your citizenship, regardless of anything without judicial process. Now, our Prime Minister was born in America, and at some point they'll find out he was involved in criminal activity. I don't believe for 1 minute the first thing they're going to do is talk about stripping Boris Johnson of his citizenship without going through judicial process. He should be gone now. But if they're not going to do that, let's be honest with you, when they find out that was happening, it's going to be used to divide, and it's going to take place in our workplaces. So one of the things I want to argue is why we should go out onto the streets and why agitation is important and why it does matter. I want to argue something else as well. We're the majority. And it's important that we recognise we're the majority. You see, when Boris Johnson and Priti Patel said not to take the knee, I mean, all of us will support different football teams, Welsh, whatever. I'm not interested in that. But I'm not going to get into that, actually, because that divides us even more. Right? It's not about the game, right? What I want to say to you is the fact that people took the knee and the majority of people supported them taking the knee is the most important thing, that the government was defeated about that. But I think that's the reason why going out onto the streets is important. To be honest with you, I'm sick and tired of kind of anti-vaxxer people coming out and saying that they speak for working class people. You know, somebody, I understand whatever it is. So, and I think it's important that we, after 2 years, in the safest way we can, go back out onto the streets for 2 reasons. One, we shouldn't have to pay the price of the pain that's going to come, you know, in terms of the national insurance increases, you know, the fact that we're going to have to choose between eating or heating. The question of misdirection is really important here. So I think if we show the unified method by coming out onto the streets and showing we're the majority, we win a very, very important argument. We show black and white unity in practice, and we show by putting how far it's important. By the way, I want to argue one other thing that's important. The government's widened its attack on racism. The GRT community, the Gypsy, Roma, Traveller community, the fact that they put that in the bill means that they're not just stopping there, they're deepening the level of racism. That's why I'm very proud that they're going to join in, and we have to look at the way they're expanding that level of racism. So I want to continue this question about the narrative, but you have to have our own narrative, which actually, fortunately for us, isn't new. It's a long tradition. It's a tradition that beat the National Front, the BNP, the EDL, the Football Lads Alliance. And we have to use those techniques now to try and push back the government, but also use it in order to strengthen working class and workplace organisation. It's, you know, it's very important that we understand that. And I'm very glad that we're having this discussion, but I'm absolutely sure and determined, like everybody else is, that by going onto the streets and continuing that fight, we can make a difference, because we've won before. We have to have that sense of our own class and our own side about how we've won before in the past and how we're going to use it in the future. So I just added that as a face and say that Sabby's not well, so I just wanted to make it very, very clear that Stand Up to Racism is so proud of working. And finally, I want to thank the TUC and the role that they've played in being at the forefront of this, and particularly Wilf for cheering and leading for so long through ups and downs. And I want to say that I want to really thank the role that Wilf's played, and you know, and the people that he's trained and will follow. So thank you very much. Make sure we participate in this conference and make sure we change that. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Wayman. You know, none of us do these things alone, and you know, I've always been surrounded by great comrades to help support what I do and what everybody else is trying to do in the fight against racism. Going to thank you all for participating in this session. Go to the workshops. There's some great workshops with some great speakers, and don't forget to join the final plenary, where we'll be talking about how we organise for those demos and marches, because we want to get as many people there as possible to make a huge statement that we won't take racism lying down. So I'll stop here. I hope you all have a great day in terms of participation in the conference, and I hope to see you all out. Well, certainly for me, it'll be the 19th of March in London. So I hope to see you there. Okay, thanks very much. Solidarity, comrades.